Okay, in this lesson we are going to start talking about statistics, and in particular two variable statistics. So previously you've been more familiar with one variable statistic, so you may have been asked to find the mean, median, and mode in a data set, for example. So that would be working with one variable statistics. And in this course we're going to focus primarily on two variable statistics. So let's just review what we mean by a variable. When we are talking about statistics, a variable is an attribute that can be measured or counted. So for example, the variable could be height, it could be number of siblings, etc. In a one variable data set, you know one attribute for each subject or person, as the case may be. And so if you only know one thing about each particular subject or person, then the types of graphs you may use to represent that data could include a bar graph, a histogram, a dot plot, and there are others. Could use a circle graph, a pictograph, all of those types of things. And with a two variable data set, you know two attributes. And if two attributes are known, then the best type of graph to use to represent or to compare those two attributes is a scatter plot, because oftentimes we are looking for a trend between those two variables, and scatter plots show trends. Okay, let's look at our first example. It says a survey of grade 12 students included a question asking whether they had part-time jobs. The table shows the frequency of results by home form. First it says identify the variables. In this case we only have one variable, and that variable is home form. And it says, should the data be graphed using a dot plot, bar graph, histogram, or scatter plot? Since this is one variable data, we should use either a dot plot or a bar graph. And the reason is we are working with one variable data. Okay, now it says draw an appropriate graph. This could be somewhat difficult to do on my iPad, but I will try. Okay. So on our graph, we are going to put our home form on the x-axis. And the frequency, or the number of students in each class with part-time jobs, on the y-axis. So across the bottom here, I'm just going to list the letters for the home form since they're all grade 12. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. I apologize for how very not well organized or neat that is. Okay. And then on the y-axis, we need to put frequency up to 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and then I could use either a bar graph or a dot plot. For a bar graph, you would just center the bar above each letter, and for a dot plot, you will just put a dot above each letter. So, for example, 12A has 4 students with part-time jobs. 12B has 6 students with part-time jobs. 12C has 2. 12D has 8. 12E has 7. 12F has 6. 12G has 3. And 12H has 5. And there we have the dot plot. Okay, next it says, give 2 descriptive statements about this data set. Well, one descriptive statement might be that 12D has the most students with jobs. That would be an example of a descriptive statement. Another one might be 12B and 12F each have 6 students with jobs. Okay, both of those are examples of descriptive statements. So basically that just means tell us something you can about this data set, or tell us something that describes this data set. Okay, example 2. This table shows the results of a survey of 15 teenagers in which participants indicated their age and the number of hours of physical activity per week. What do you know about each person? Well, in this case, for each person, we know their age and we know the number of weekly hours of physical activity. Then it says identify the variables. Well, those would be them. Age, number of weekly hours of activity. What type of graph would be appropriate for this data set? Well, since we are looking at 2 variables, the best graph to use here would be a scatter plot. Then it says, draw the appropriate graph. Up a bit. So we're going to create a scatter plot, and again that's going to be a little tricky on this iPad, hopefully a little easier for you in your notes. Okay, so we will put age on the x-axis and the hours per week of activity on the y-axis. Now I'm going to use a squiggly symbol on the x-axis. Remember, that means I'm going to skip some values because the youngest age I'm dealing with here is 14, and we have to go up to 19. So 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Okay. And the hours per week goes up, I believe, to 14. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. And now we'll fill in the scatter plot. So the first person is 14 and gets 3 hours per week. 16 and 0, just filling in the points from their table, 17 and 4. Then we have a 15-year-old who gets 10. An 18-year-old that gets only 1. A 19-year-old that gets 6, as well as a 19-year-old that gets 5. An 18-year-old that gets 9. A 13-year-old that gets 10. Oh, I guess I didn't allow a spot for a 13-year-old. Put that about where it would be. A 15-year-old that gets none. A 16-year-old that gets none. Right beside the other one. A 16-year-old that gets 14. A 16-year-old that gets 10. A 14-year-old that gets 7. And a 17-year-old that gets none. Really not seeing a trend in this graph at all. Now it says pose a question that would require one variable data analysis. So thinking of a question that would require only one of these sets of data, okay, in order to answer it. So an example of that kind of question would be, what is the average number of hours of physical activity for teens per week? In order to answer that question, we would not actually need to know how old each of these students were. All we would need to know is how many hours of activity each of them gets, and then we could find the average. Now, the next one says pose a question that would require two variable data analysis. Then we're looking more at the relationship between these two things. So, for example, is there a relationship between age and the number of hours of physical activity per week? In order to answer that, we would need to know something about both of these variables and the relationship between them. And that concludes your lesson.